3 years after a painful divorce, one quiet decision changed everything. She walked into a house filled with resentment, silence, and a woman who never wanted her there. What began as duty slowly became sacrifice, then something deeper. No gratitude, no escape, just years of giving. But one letter on a quiet afternoon revealed a truth no one expected. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most leave behind the greatest lesson. Rachel's life had taken an unexpected turn. 3 years ago, she had been married with plans for a bright future. But life, as it often does, threw her a curveball. Her marriage ended in a painful divorce. Left alone, heartbroken, and with little direction, Rachel retreated into herself. She distanced herself from family, friends, and the world she once knew, unsure of what was next. But even in the midst of her own sorrow, a call came that would change the course of her life forever. Her ex-husband Adam had a mother named Margaret. Margaret was a proud woman, full of life. But after suffering a debilitating stroke, she was left bedridden, unable to care for herself. Adam, caught up in his own world, made it clear that he couldn't take care of his mother. It was then that Rachel made the choice that no one, not even she, had expected her to make. Though they were no longer together, Rachel had always been the compassionate type, the one who took care of others. Margaret had always been somewhat cold toward her, and the tension between them had been palpable during the marriage, but Rachel couldn't ignore the fact that Margaret was family, even if they had never been particularly close. She felt a deep sense of responsibility, perhaps a way to heal the wounds left from her failed marriage. After all, this was the mother of the man she had once loved. The decision to care for Margaret was not easy, nor was it welcomed by others. Rachel's family had questioned her decision. They saw her as fragile, recently divorced, still reeling from the emotional fallout. "Why put yourself through that?" they asked. "You need to focus on your own healing." But Rachel didn't listen. She packed her things and moved into Margaret's house, a decision that was driven more by a sense of duty than love. The house was large and cold, just like Margaret. The house smelled of stale air and old furniture, and the walls seemed to echo with memories of a time when Margaret was healthy and full of life. Rachel couldn't help but feel a pang of regret for the woman who had once been so full of energy and vitality. The first few days were difficult. Rachel was not used to taking care of someone so dependent. Margaret's once sharp tongue now carried a touch of bitterness as she lay in her bed, helpless. The woman who had once held so much power over her son's life and marriage was now entirely reliant on Rachel. The irony wasn't lost on her. Margaret, who had been critical of Rachel at every turn during their marriage, was now entirely at her mercy. Rachel helped Margaret with everything: bathing, feeding, moving her from the bed to a chair, and administering medications. The tasks were monotonous, tiring, and physically demanding, but what was even harder was the emotional toll. Margaret's sharp comments still stung. "You'll never be good enough," Margaret would mutter when Rachel would try to cheer her up. "I see the way you look at me. You think you're too good for this." At night, Rachel would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Was this a punishment for her failed marriage? She meant to pay for her past mistakes by sacrificing her future? The loneliness was deafening. There were no distractions, no escape. Rachel was trapped in a life she never wanted, serving a woman who didn't even appreciate her. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Rachel began to see the cracks in Margaret's facade. Beneath the biting remarks and the sharp tongue, there was fear. Fear of the future, fear of being abandoned, fear of dying alone. Slowly, Rachel began to see the woman Margaret had once been, long before she became the mother-in-law who had criticized her at every turn. It was then that Rachel began to understand the true nature of sacrifice. It wasn't about giving up everything for someone else. It was about understanding their pain and providing care, even when it wasn't reciprocated. In those quiet moments when Margaret's sharp words faded into silence, Rachel found a connection with her. A connection that was not built on marriage, but on shared humanity. Rachel didn't know it at the time, but she was learning to heal. In giving of herself, she began to rebuild the parts of herself that had been shattered. Every small gesture, changing Margaret's position in bed, making her favorite tea, listening to her complaints, was slowly repairing Rachel's own broken heart. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt needed. She was no longer the wife who had failed, or the woman cast aside. She was a caregiver, an anchor in a stormy sea, and in the process she was slowly starting to see herself in a new light. But the road ahead was still long, and Rachel had no idea just how far she would go for the woman who had never shown her kindness, but whom she now cared for as if she were her own mother. As the months passed, Rachel found herself buried under the weight of responsibility. Caring for Margaret had become her entire life. Every day followed the same exhausting routine: work during the day and then back home to care for Margaret at night. The days blurred together, and Rachel began to feel like a mere shadow of herself. She had given up everything: her social life, her dreams, and even her sense of freedom. There was no time for friends, no time for hobbies, and certainly no time for romance. All that mattered was Margaret's care, and that responsibility consumed her. Rachel had been working as a part-time teacher at a local school. When she had first taken the job, she had been hopeful that it would offer a break from the constant demands of caregiving. But soon the lines between her work and home life began to blur. She would rush home from school, barely having enough time to catch her breath before she was back in caretaker mode. There were always things to be done: changing Margaret's position in bed to prevent sores, cooking meals, and most of all, making sure Margaret's emotional needs were met. It was a draining existence. Margaret's once sharp tongue had softened over time, but the bitterness remained. At first, Margaret had tried to fight the helplessness she felt, snapping at Rachel when she couldn't do something for herself. Over time, however, Margaret's condition worsened and she became even more dependent. She couldn't walk and her speech was barely intelligible, but her pride was still there, and that pride made the situation harder for both of them. Every evening, Rachel would sit beside Margaret's bed, patiently feeding her, listening to her complaints, and attempting to ease her pain. But Margaret's words were rarely kind, and when they were, they came out as awkward attempts at appreciation. "You're doing all right, I suppose," Margaret would say, her voice weak and raspy. But there was never a deep, heartfelt thank you, never the warmth that Rachel so desperately needed. In the silence of the house, Rachel would often reflect on the life she had left behind. The life before caring for Margaret seemed like a distant memory. She had been a woman with dreams, a woman with ambitions. But now she was a caregiver and nothing else. There were days when she resented the role, when the exhaustion was too much to bear. She would sit on the edge of her bed after a long day, her body aching, her mind spinning, wondering if she would ever be free again. One particularly difficult day after a long shift at school, Rachel returned to find Margaret in a rare moment of clarity. The old woman had been struggling with an infection, and her health had taken a turn for the worse. She was weak, barely able to sit up, and her face was pale with exhaustion. Rachel rushed to her side, panic creeping into her heart. Margaret, seeing the fear in Rachel's eyes, finally spoke in a soft voice. "You've been doing this for so long, Rachel. You've given up everything. You should leave. Go find yourself again." Rachel froze, the words cutting through her like a knife. Margaret had never shown any concern for her well-being before. Her entire life, Margaret had been wrapped up in her own sense of entitlement, never acknowledging the sacrifices Rachel had made. But here, in this moment, Margaret was telling her to go. For the first time in years, Rachel allowed herself to imagine a different life. A life where she wasn't a caregiver, where she wasn't constantly on edge, worn down by the weight of Margaret's needs. She had sacrificed so much, given up her own happiness, and now Margaret was telling her to let go. But the guilt hit hard. Could she really leave now when Margaret needed her most? Was it selfish to consider her own happiness after everything she had done? Rachel sat by Margaret's bed, her emotions in turmoil. The woman who had once been so critical of her, the woman who had caused so much pain in her life, was now asking her to let go. Rachel didn't have an answer. That night, after Margaret fell asleep, Rachel found herself in the quiet solitude of the house. The decision weighed heavily on her heart. She wasn't just caring for Margaret. She was also caring for herself in some twisted way. This act of giving had filled the emptiness inside her, made her feel needed in a way she hadn't felt in years. But at what cost? Was this what her life had become? A never-ending cycle of giving without receiving. In the darkness, Rachel cried silently. It wasn't the tears of sorrow that usually came when she felt overwhelmed. This was something deeper. These were the tears of a woman who had been lost for so long, trying to find herself again in the midst of a life she hadn't chosen. Rachel longed for a life where she could love without feeling like she was giving up everything else. As the days passed, Rachel made a silent promise to herself that she would find balance, even if it meant facing the difficult choice of letting go. She couldn't keep living for someone else, not when her own future was slipping away. But how could she walk away from the woman who needed her so much? The answer seemed impossible to find. And yet, Rachel knew that the weight of this responsibility could not carry on forever. The routine of caring for Margaret continued, each day blending seamlessly into the next. Rachel had resigned herself to the life she had built around Margaret's needs. The thought of leaving or breaking free from this daily cycle felt like an impossible dream. But even in the midst of this relentless caregiving, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a quiet tension in the air, a sense that something was about to change, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. It was a typical Thursday afternoon when Rachel's world shifted. She had just finished her part-time teaching job and returned home early to check on Margaret. Rachel had grown accustomed to the slow pace of her day-to-day life, but that day was different. As she walked into the house, a strange feeling washed over her. The house was too quiet. There was no sound of Margaret's low murmurs or the shuffle of her feet on the floor. For a moment, Rachel stood still in the doorway, feeling a sense of unease. When Rachel walked into the living room, she noticed a letter on the coffee table. It was an official-looking envelope, and the return address was from a lawyer's office. Her heart skipped a beat. The envelope had Margaret's name on it, and for the first time in months, Rachel felt a pang of curiosity mixed with a sense of dread. She had never expected to receive anything like this, but somehow she knew it had something to do with Margaret. She sat down on the couch, her fingers trembling as she opened the letter. It was a legal document, one that Rachel wasn't prepared for. It turned out that the letter was a notice about Margaret's estate, something she had never even considered. Rachel had been so consumed with caring for Margaret that she hadn't once thought about what would happen after Margaret passed away. The letter detailed the distribution of Margaret's assets, something she had assumed would go to her son, Adam, the same man who had abandoned her mother to Rachel's care. But the shock came as Rachel read the lines on the paper. Margaret had cut Adam out of her will entirely. Instead, everything was to go to Rachel. All the years of service, all the sacrifices Rachel had made, had not gone unnoticed. Margaret had seen the love and dedication Rachel had shown even when Rachel had no reason to be kind to her. The letter stated that the house, her savings, and her personal belongings were all to be transferred to Rachel after her death. Rachel was frozen. She sat there staring at the letter in disbelief. It was surreal. How could Margaret, the woman who had spent years making her feel insignificant, now be giving her everything? There had never been a moment where Margaret had expressed gratitude for all the care Rachel had given her. In fact, Margaret had been difficult, often demanding and critical, making every moment of caregiving a struggle. Yet, despite it all, Rachel had remained dedicated to her, trying her best to meet Margaret's needs. And now, Margaret had acknowledged that dedication in the only way she knew how. Rachel's emotions swirled, guilt, confusion, and a strange sense of validation. She had never cared about money, never expected anything in return for the years she had spent caring for Margaret. But this was different. The realization that Margaret had left everything to her felt like a burden, not a gift. Rachel didn't want Margaret's things. She didn't need them. What she needed was Margaret's love and approval, something she had never received. For hours, Rachel sat with the letter, trying to make sense of it all. What did this inheritance really mean? Was it a final act of love from Margaret, or was it an attempt to make amends for all the years of harsh words and indifference? The weight of the letter seemed too heavy to carry, and the responsibility it represented was overwhelming. Rachel wondered if this had been Margaret's way of acknowledging everything she had done. But if that was the case, why had Margaret never spoken these words directly to Rachel? Why had she chosen to leave them in a letter instead of expressing them face to face? Rachel's thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound from the hallway. Margaret, though frail and weak, had stirred. Rachel quickly put the letter aside and walked to Margaret's room, where she found her struggling to sit up in bed. Margaret's once sharp eyes were now clouded with age, but there was something different in her expression today. She looked at Rachel with a quiet intensity as though she were finally ready to speak the truth. "Rachel," Margaret said, her voice raspy, "I know you found the letter." Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't know what to say. The last thing she had expected was for Margaret to bring it up. But Margaret's gaze softened, and for the first time in years, Rachel saw vulnerability in her eyes. "I never wanted you to feel obligated," Margaret continued, her words slow but steady. "I've watched you, Rachel. I've watched you give everything you have to me, and I know I've never been kind to you. I've made you feel small, but you were always there when I needed you, even when my own son couldn't be." Rachel didn't know how to respond. The weight of Margaret's words settled heavily on her heart. All these years, she had believed that Margaret would never see the sacrifices she had made. But now Margaret was acknowledging them. It was the validation Rachel had longed for but had never thought she would receive. Margaret took a deep breath, her frail hands clutching the blanket. "I wanted to thank you, Rachel. You've shown me what real love is, and I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." In that moment, everything changed. Margaret's confession was more valuable than any inheritance. The years of caregiving, the loneliness, the exhaustion, it all seemed worth it now. Margaret had finally seen Rachel, truly seen her, and in her own way had expressed the love Rachel had long yearned for. The letter wasn't just about money. It was Margaret's way of acknowledging that Rachel had been the one to care for her, to give her the dignity she had lost. Rachel wiped away the tears that had fallen without her knowing. "Thank you, Margaret," she whispered, her voice breaking. For the first time in 3 years, Rachel felt at peace. She had been seen, she had been heard, and that was worth more than any inheritance could ever be.